The war room of Frostholm Fortress stood silent except for the crackling of torchlight against stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of military planning. King Magnus Blackthorn stood over the massive oak table where maps of the Northern Territories lay spread like the skin of some ancient beast, marked with troop positions and supply routes that would decide the fate of thousands. At 30 years old, he commanded respect through demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege, his steel gray eyes reading terrain and tactics with the precision of a man who understood that every decision carried the weight of lives that could be saved or lost. The winter wind howled beyond the fortress walls, carrying with it the promise of another brutal storm that would test the endurance of both soldier and civilian alike. Magnus traced his finger along the border territories where tensions with Iron Peak had escalated over the past 3 months, skirmishes that threatened to ignite into full warfare if not managed with careful strategic thinking. His advisors had departed an hour earlier, leaving recommendations that favored aggressive posturing over patient diplomacy, counsel that Magnus had neither accepted nor rejected, choosing instead to study the situation from every possible angle before committing to action that could not be undone. The maps before him told stories beyond simple geography, supply lines that could sustain an army or starve it, mountain passes that became death traps in winter, villages that would burn if warfare spread beyond controlled engagement zones. Magnus had learned young that war was mathematics written in blood, and the calculations required more than courage or conviction. They demanded the willingness to see clearly, even when clarity revealed uncomfortable truths about the costs that strategy imposed on those least able to bear them. His hand moved unconsciously to the scar along his jaw, a reminder of the night 12 years ago when everything had changed. The night his parents had died in what official records called a border skirmish, but what Magnus had come to understand was something far more deliberate. That night had taught him that emotion was a blade that cut the wielder as deeply as the target, that love made kings vulnerable in ways that enemies would exploit without hesitation or mercy. Since then, Magnus had built walls around his heart that were higher and thicker than any fortress stone, believing that isolation was the price of effective leadership. Yet tonight, beneath the howling wind and the weight of military decisions, something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with a quality Magnus could not name, as though the approaching storm carried whispers of change that would test foundations he had thought unshakable. He dismissed the feeling as exhaustion, the accumulated fatigue of years spent bearing responsibilities that allowed no rest, no moment of vulnerability that might crack the image of strength his kingdom required him to project without fail or faltering. A sharp knock interrupted his contemplation. Captain Theron Ironhide entered without waiting for acknowledgement, his weathered face bearing an expression Magnus had learned to read over 15 years of service together. Something unusual had occurred, something that fell outside the normal patterns of fortress routine. "Movement at the main gate, Your Majesty. Someone approaches through the storm." Magnus straightened from the maps, his tactical mind immediately shifting to threat assessment. Visitors during winter storms were rare enough to warrant caution, and those who traveled through conditions that could kill the unprepared usually carried either desperate news or dangerous intentions. His hand moved instinctively toward the sword that hung at his side, a gesture so practiced it required no conscious thought. "What manner of visitor travels through a blizzard at this hour?" Theron's hesitation spoke volumes before his words provided detail. "An Omega, Your Majesty. Alone. No supplies visible, inadequate clothing for the conditions. The guards report she has been observing our gate rotations with what appears to be tactical awareness, rather than simple desperation." The description triggered multiple calculations in Magnus's mind simultaneously. An Omega traveling alone suggested either flight from danger or approach with purpose. The tactical observation indicated intelligence and training that exceeded typical civilian awareness. The combination created a puzzle that demanded investigation rather than simple dismissal or automatic charity. Magnus moved toward the courtyard with the measured stride of a man who had learned that rushing toward unknown situations often created more problems than it solved. The stone steps descended through corridors where torchlight painted shadows that danced like memories of all the kings who had walked these paths before him, each bearing the weight of decisions that shaped the fates of thousands who would never know the names of those who determined their futures through choices made in rooms they would never enter. The courtyard held perhaps 20 soldiers, their formation creating a protective semicircle around the main gate while maintaining sightlines that would allow response to any threat that might emerge from the swirling snow beyond. Their discipline was evident in the way they held position, despite the wind that drove ice crystals against exposed skin with cutting force. Magnus had trained these men personally, instilling in them the understanding that protection required vigilance, even when vigilance meant enduring discomfort that others might flee. Beyond the iron bars of the gate, barely visible through the storm's fury, a figure huddled against the stone archway. The wind had plastered wet snow against tattered fabric that might once have been a cloak, but now offered little more than symbolic protection against elements that killed without malice or mercy, simply through the mathematical certainty of exposure over time. Magnus approached the gate and the wind shifted at precisely that moment, carrying with it a scent that struck him with physical force that drove the breath from his lungs. It was warmth in the midst of winter, honey and wildflowers mixed with something that bypassed conscious thought to trigger responses written into the deepest parts of his nature. The mate bond, that legendary connection he had dismissed as romantic fantasy, told by those who had never borne the responsibilities that made such connections dangerous liabilities rather than desired blessings. But even as his mind recognized what the scent signified, even as some part of him that had been dormant for years stirred with recognition that felt like coming home after lifelong exile, his wolf consciousness rejected the bond with violence that sent pain shooting through his entire nervous system. The internal rejection was unprecedented in every record Magnus had studied. Mate bonds did not activate and reject simultaneously. The contradiction suggested something fundamentally wrong, some corruption or complication that transformed what should be certainty into confusion that threatened the stability his kingdom required him to maintain. He forced himself to breathe through the pain, to focus on the practical situation rather than the internal chaos that fought for dominance over his attention. The figure at the gate shifted, and moonlight breaking briefly through the storm clouds caught silver hair beneath a hood that had fallen back to reveal features that would have been beautiful if not for the exhaustion and cold that had drained them of vitality. Her eyes, when they met his, were deep violet, a color so unusual it seemed almost unnatural, and they held within them a combination of fear, determination, and careful observation that suggested a mind still functioning despite physical distress that would have overwhelmed lesser constitutions. She was Omega, unmistakably so. Her scent and slight build confirmed what her circumstances suggested. Yet there was something in the way she held herself, a core of strength that even obvious hunger and hypothermia could not fully diminish, that created cognitive dissonance between what Magnus saw and what his experience told him Omegas should be. His training and conditioning insisted that Omegas were meant to be protected, sheltered, kept safe within structures that acknowledged their vulnerability. This woman looked like she had walked through fire and learned to carry the burns as armor rather than weakness. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was surprisingly strong despite lips that had turned blue with cold. Her words carried an accent Magnus could not immediately place, suggesting origins beyond the immediate territories. "I apologize for the disturbance at this hour. I would not ask if circumstances allowed other options." Magnus found himself stepping closer to the gate, despite the warning his wolf was still broadcasting through his nervous system, that strange rejection that felt like touching flame while craving its warmth. "What circumstances bring you to my gates in the middle of a blizzard?" She drew a breath that seemed to cost her considerable effort. "I have been traveling for 3 days through conditions that would be inadvisable under better circumstances. I require shelter until the storm passes. Nothing more. I will not burden your hospitality beyond basic survival." The request was reasonable, even modest by the standards of travelers seeking refuge from deadly weather. Yet something in the way she phrased it, the careful limitation of her ask, suggested someone who had learned that requesting too much invited rejection, while requesting too little invited exploitation. Magnus studied her face, noting details his tactical training insisted he catalog and analyze. The way her eyes tracked guard positions even while maintaining focus on him, the manner in which she had positioned herself within the archway to minimize exposure to wind while maintaining visibility of anyone who might approach. Small indicators that this was someone who thought in terms of angles and advantages, despite circumstances that should have reduced her focus to simple desperation. "Where were you traveling from?" Magnus asked, testing her response to direct questions. Her hesitation lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to be noticeable but brief enough to avoid seeming evasive. "South, Your Majesty. From territories where remaining had become less safe than risking the journey north." The answer provided information while revealing nothing specific, a diplomatic evasion that suggested either practice or natural aptitude for navigating conversations where truth and safety might not align. Magnus felt his analytical mind engaging with the puzzle she represented, even as his wolf continued its painful internal rejection of the bond that his consciousness recognized with clarity that permitted no denial. "I do not require palatial accommodations," she continued, when Magnus did not immediately respond. "A space by your gate where the wind cannot reach would suffice. I understand that allowing strangers within your walls during uncertain times would be imprudent. I ask only for the minimum shelter that might permit survival until conditions improve enough to continue my journey." The request was so modest it bordered on heartbreaking, asking for nothing beyond what might be shown to a starving dog, a patch of ground protected from elements that killed with mathematical certainty if exposure continued long enough. Yet even as Magnus registered the humility of her ask, he noticed how her phrasing acknowledged his legitimate security concerns while positioning her request as reasonable under the circumstances. She was negotiating even while appearing to simply beg for basic mercy. Magnus made his decision based on factors he could not have fully articulated even to himself. Tactical curiosity about her evident observational skills. A sense that turning away someone who demonstrated such careful intelligence would be wasteful when his kingdom faced threats that required every advantage he could gather. And beneath those rational justifications, something deeper that his wolf rejected but his soul recognized, a pull toward this stranger that bypassed logic to operate on frequencies he had thought himself incapable of receiving after so many years of deliberate isolation. "No," Magnus said firmly, and watched hope die in her expression, her shoulders sagging with defeat that somehow made her seem smaller despite maintaining her physical position. But before she could turn away into the storm that would almost certainly claim her life within hours, he continued in a voice that came out rougher than he intended. "You will not sleep by my gate like some unwanted animal left to survive on scraps of protection. You will come inside where I can determine whether you represent opportunity or threat to my kingdom." Her eyes widened with disbelief that transformed rapidly into wary hope. "Your Majesty, I could not possibly impose on your hospitality to such degree. A corner by the gate would truly suffice." "You misunderstand the nature of what I offer," Magnus replied, gesturing to the guards to open the gate. "This is not charity born from soft sentiment. You have demonstrated observational awareness that suggests either training or exceptional natural aptitude. You will be housed, fed, and questioned until I determine your value or danger to my interests. Consider yourself neither guest nor prisoner, but something between, an unknown variable that requires analysis before classification." The heavy iron gate swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo the protest his wolf was still broadcasting through his nervous system. The woman stepped forward with movements that tried to hide a pronounced limp, her left leg clearly injured, though she attempted to maintain normal gait despite obvious pain. Magnus noticed how she cataloged everything as she entered, her eyes tracking guard positions, noting architectural features, mapping the space with the same tactical awareness that had initially drawn his attention. "What is your name?" he asked as they climbed the curved staircase toward the guest quarters. She hesitated, her fingers trailing along the carved banister. "Alara, Your Majesty." The name suited her perfectly. Angelic, otherworldly, beautiful. Magnus found himself repeating it silently, savoring how it felt in his mind. He guided her to the finest guest chamber, its hearth already crackling with warmth. Rich tapestries covered the stone walls, and a 4-poster bed dominated the space, piled high with furs and silken coverlets. Alara stood in the doorway, as if afraid to enter, wonder filling her features. "This is too much," she whispered. "I asked only for shelter by your gate, and I decided you deserved better." Magnus moved to light additional candles, needing the activity to distract himself from her intoxicating presence. "There are clean clothes in the wardrobe. Food will be brought shortly." She stepped carefully into the room, her movements graceful despite obvious exhaustion. "Why are you doing this? You don't know anything about me." The question stopped him short. Why was he doing this? Beyond the mate bond pulling at his consciousness, beyond the protective instincts she triggered, there was something else. Her dignity in the face of desperation reminded him of strength he had forgotten existed, the kind that came from enduring rather than conquering. "Perhaps that's exactly why," he said finally. "Too often knowing someone means knowing their agenda." Alara sank onto the edge of the bed, her careful composure finally cracking. "I have no agenda, Your Majesty. Only gratitude." As he prepared to leave her to rest, she called softly, "Your Majesty." He turned back to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you. Not just for the room or the food. Thank you for seeing me as worth the investment of your time when you could have simply turned away." The words struck something in Magnus's chest that had been frozen for so long he had forgotten it could feel warmth. He nodded acknowledgement because words seemed inadequate, then left before the pain of his wolf's rejection could force him to flee from her presence like a coward running from battle. He lacked courage to fight. In the corridor outside her chamber, Magnus leaned against cold stone and tried to process what had just occurred. The mate bond was undeniable, the most certain thing he had felt in years of living with calculated uncertainty. Yet his wolf rejected her with violence that suggested some fundamental corruption in what should be natural recognition. The contradiction threatened everything he thought he understood about the nature of bonds between Alpha and Omega, about destiny and choice, about whether the universe operated according to patterns that could be understood, or chaos that merely appeared orderly when viewed from insufficient distance. Captain Theron approached with a physician in tow, the old man carrying a medical bag that had treated everything from battlefield wounds to childhood illnesses over 40 years of service to the Blackthorn line. Dr. Aldwin nodded to Magnus with the familiarity of someone who had known the king since birth. "The Omega requires examination," Magnus said. "Injuries to assess, exposure to treat, general health to evaluate. Report your findings to me directly before dawn." Aldwin studied his king with eyes that saw beyond surface presentation to underlying turmoil. "As you command, Your Majesty, though I sense you require examination yourself. When did you last shift? Your wolf energy feels wrong, compressed rather than flowing naturally." The observation touched on territory Magnus had forbidden himself from acknowledging. 8 years, he admitted. Since the night his parents died and his wolf had retreated into depths he could not reach despite efforts that had exhausted both body and spirit. 8 years, Aldwin repeated with concern. "That is dangerous, Your Majesty. A wolf denied too long becomes twisted, and when it finally emerges the results can be catastrophic. You must find a way to reconnect before the separation becomes permanent." Magnus said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not sound like excuse or admission of weakness he could not afford to reveal. He dismissed both physician and captain, then made his way to his private chambers where sleep would not come, despite exhaustion that had accumulated over months of carrying responsibilities that permitted no rest. Instead, he stood at his window looking out over the fortress and the storm beyond, wondering what fate had brought Alara to his gates on this particular night. Whether her arrival represented salvation or destruction, opportunity or threat, Whether the pain his wolf transmitted with every thought of her signified danger, he should flee or trial, he needed to endure before reaching understanding, that would transform everything he thought he knew about the nature of power and connection, and what it meant to rule, not just with strength, but with wisdom, earned through surviving challenges that broke weaker men. The wind howled against stone walls that had stood for centuries, carrying whispers that might be promise or warning depending on interpretation, and Magnus stood alone with thoughts that chased themselves in circles until dawn broke cold and gray over a kingdom that had no idea how much would change in the days ahead, how foundations that seemed eternal would be tested by forces neither King nor Omega fully understood, but both would need to navigate if either hoped to survive with hearts and souls intact when storms of human making proved more dangerous than any blizzard winter could conjure. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over Frostholm Fortress, light seeping through heavy clouds that promised more snow before the day ended. Magnus had not slept, his night consumed by reviewing intelligence reports about border tensions, while his mind refused to stop returning to the Omega sleeping 3 floors below, the woman whose presence created equations he could not solve, despite tactical training that had prepared him for every scenario, except the one where his own nature turned against itself in rejection and recognition simultaneously. Dr. Aldwin's report arrived with the morning meal Magnus did not eat. Medical assessments written in the physician's careful hand, detailing injuries consistent with prolonged travel through hostile conditions, and what appeared to be older wounds, suggesting a history of abuse that had left both physical and psychological marks. Malnutrition, exhaustion, a badly sprained ankle that would require weeks to heal properly, and beneath it all, a constitution that the physician noted as remarkably resilient given circumstances that would have killed most individuals of similar build and apparent fragility. But it was Aldwin's final observation that made Magnus read the passage 3 times to ensure he understood correctly. The Omega demonstrates unusual awareness of her surroundings even during medical examination, tracking movements with precision that suggests either military training or survival instincts honed through extended exposure to dangerous environments. When questioned about her journey, she provided answers that were factually accurate while revealing minimal actionable intelligence about origins or intentions. In my professional opinion, Your Majesty, this woman possesses capabilities that significantly exceed what her current condition might suggest. Magnus set the report aside as Captain Theron entered without knocking, a privilege earned through 15 years of loyal service and friendship that predated Magnus's ascension to the throne. The expression on Theron's weathered face communicated urgency before words provided detail. "The Council demands emergency session, Your Majesty. Lord Chancellor Valerius has called for immediate assembly regarding what he terms a security breach that threatens the integrity of fortress protocols." Magnus felt controlled anger kindle in his chest. They object to one refugee being offered shelter during a storm that would have killed her within hours of being turned away. Theron's expression suggested he shared the sentiment, but loyalty required him to present all information, regardless of personal feelings. "Servants have been talking. Word has spread that you personally escorted an unknown Omega to the finest guest quarters, that you showed her consideration beyond what protocol demands for refugees. When does Valerius expect this assembly?" "Within the hour. He has already gathered support among the more traditional council members." Magnus stood and began preparing for confrontation that would test not just his authority, but his judgment. "Tell Valerius I will attend his session, but inform him that I expect detailed justification for why offering shelter to a single refugee constitutes crisis worthy of interrupting strategic planning during a period when border tensions threaten to escalate into open warfare." The war room had been transformed into council chamber, the maps of military campaigns replaced by formal seating arrangements. 12 council members occupied positions according to rank and influence, their faces reflecting various degrees of concern and disapproval. Lord Chancellor Valerius stood at the head of the table opposite Magnus's throne, his silver hair and aristocratic bearing lending him authority that 3 decades of political maneuvering had reinforced. His expression communicated disappointment rather than anger, the face of a mentor witnessing a student's failure. Your Majesty, Valerius began with tone that managed to convey respect while implying correction. We gather in response to developments that concern those of us tasked with maintaining the security and stability your leadership requires. Last night you made decisions regarding an unknown individual that deviate significantly from protocols designed to protect both yourself and the kingdom you serve. Magnus settled into his throne with deliberate calm, projecting confidence, while his wolf continued transmitting dull pain that made concentration require active effort. I offered shelter to a refugee during a storm that would have been fatal. This hardly seems like decision requiring emergency council assembly when our attention should focus on border tensions that threaten actual warfare. Valerius's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. It is not the act of shelter we question, Your Majesty, but the manner and extent of accommodation provided. You personally escorted this unknown individual to guest quarters reserved for visiting dignitaries. Your behavior suggests attachment formed with impossible speed to someone about whom we know nothing. Before Magnus could respond, High Priestess Morgana spoke from her position to Valerius's right, her pale eyes holding the zealous certainty of someone who believed divine guidance informed her perspectives. The timing itself is troubling, Your Majesty. An unknown Omega appears at our gates during a period of unusual celestial alignment, bearing physical characteristics that match descriptions found in texts concerning prophetic patterns. Magnus felt his jaw tighten at the introduction of prophetic elements into what should be practical discussion. You suggest she represents some form of divine warning? I suggest that dismissing patterns because they make us uncomfortable is dangerous, Morgana replied smoothly. There are forces at work in this world that transcend simple material understanding. General Brennan's voice cut through the building tension before Magnus needed to navigate the trap Morgana had constructed. Respectfully, High Priestess, if we start making military and political decisions based on celestial alignments and prophecies, we will paralyze ourselves into inaction. The Omega appeared during a storm because storms are when desperate people seek shelter. She possesses unusual awareness because survival requires learning to observe carefully. Magnus felt gratitude toward the old general who had served his father and grandfather before him. General Brennan raises valid points, but let me address the underlying concern directly. My decision was based on tactical calculation. The Omega demonstrates observational skills that suggest either training or exceptional natural aptitude. She navigated to our fortress through conditions that killed 3 experienced travelers last week. She positions herself to maintain sight lines even while requesting charity. These are not characteristics of helpless victim, but of someone who possesses capabilities we would be foolish to dismiss. The logic was sound, and Magnus could see several council members reconsidering their initial objections. But Valerius was not so easily redirected. Your assessment may prove accurate, Your Majesty, but it does not address the central concern regarding speed and nature of attachment you have demonstrated. Kings cannot afford to make decisions about security based on tactical curiosity, when such decisions might also serve emotional needs that cloud judgment. Before Magnus could formulate response, the door to the council chamber opened, and Alara entered with confidence that seemed impossible given her injuries and circumstances. She had found the wardrobe Magnus mentioned, now dressed in simple but well-made clothes that transformed her from bedraggled refugee into something that commanded attention through bearing rather than decoration. Her silver hair had been cleaned and braided, and despite the limp, she moved with grace that made the injury seem almost irrelevant. I apologize for the interruption, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. But I could not help overhearing discussion regarding my presence and the security concerns it generates. Perhaps I can address those concerns directly rather than requiring you to speculate. The audacity of her entrance struck the council momentarily silent. Omegas did not interrupt council sessions. The violation of protocol was so complete, it created space for response before anyone could formulate objection. You believe you can address security concerns? Valerius asked with polite incredulity. Alara met his gaze without flinching. I can certainly provide information more accurate than speculation. You want to know whether I represent threat to your king or kingdom. The answer is that I represent neither if treated with basic dignity, but could potentially become exactly the threat you fear if handled with cruelty that would leave me nothing to lose." The honesty was startling in its directness. Magnus found himself leaning forward. "You possess unusual confidence for someone in your position," Morgana observed. "One might almost think you believe yourself equal to those born to power." Alara turned to face the High Priestess with expression that communicated neither hostility nor deference. "I possess unusual perspective gained through unusual circumstances. I have spent 15 years as Omega servant in Lord Cassius Ravenwood's War Council, not as participant but as functionary, someone meant to pour wine and clear dishes, while remaining invisible to those discussing matters they believed beneath notice of someone of my station." The revelation sent ripples through the council chamber. Lord Cassius Ravenwood commanded armies that could tip the balance in any conflict. "You expect us to believe Cassius allowed an Omega access to his military planning?" Valerius asked skeptically. Alara's smile held no humor. He did not allow anything. He simply did not notice. To men like Cassius, Omegas in servant roles are furniture that happens to move and follow instructions. You discuss everything in front of furniture because furniture has no agency. I learned young that invisibility was weapon as much as weakness. She moved to the war table where maps still showed troop positions and supply routes, placing her finger on specific locations. "Your current deployment along the Iron Peak border is vulnerable to supply line interdiction if they move forces through this mountain pass. You have insufficient coverage because you are assuming they will approach through the valley, where terrain favors defensive positions. But Cassius taught his commanders never to approach where enemies expect, always to find the path that seems impossible and make it possible through superior logistics." Magnus stood and approached the table, studying the route she indicated. "That pass is considered impassable during winter conditions." Alara met his eyes. "It is considered impassable by those who have not spent years listening to Cassius's commanders explain exactly how to move supplies through impossible terrain using techniques developed over generations of military innovation." The analysis was sophisticated enough that Magnus could not dismiss it as lucky guess. If she was accurate, the vulnerability she identified could cost him hundreds of lives. "You would share this intelligence freely?" Magnus asked. Alara's expression shifted to something that might be sadness. "I share it because keeping it secret would make me complicit in deaths I have power to prevent. I learned many things in Cassius's service, Your Majesty. One of the most important was that remaining silent when you possess knowledge that could save lives makes you as responsible for those deaths as if you had wielded the weapons yourself." General Brennan spoke into the silence. "If her assessment is accurate, we need to adjust our deployment immediately." "If her assessment is accurate," Valerius emphasized, "we have only her word that she possesses the knowledge she claims. Then verify the intelligence before acting on it," Alara replied. "Send scouts to observe the pass. Interview your own intelligence sources. I am not asking you to trust me blindly. I am asking you to treat the information I provide with the same rigorous analysis you would apply to intelligence from any source." Magnus made his decision. "Captain Theron, send your best scouts to observe the pass she indicated. I want reports within 48 hours. General Brennan, begin contingency planning for adjusted deployment, but do not implement changes until we have confirmation." Both men nodded and departed. Magnus turned back to the council members who remained, noting expressions that ranged from thoughtful consideration to lingering suspicion. "This demonstrates exactly the danger we warned about," Valerius said quietly. "You are making military decisions based on information provided by someone we know nothing about." The logic was frustratingly sound. Magnus knew this from his own experience using misdirection to manipulate enemies. You raise valid concerns, but consider the alternative. If we reject useful intelligence because we cannot immediately verify the source, we blind ourselves to information that might be critical. Before Valerius could respond, Morgana interjected. "There are other concerns beyond tactical intelligence, Your Majesty. I have been researching texts concerning historical patterns and prophetic warnings. What I have discovered troubles me deeply." Magnus suppressed his irritation. "What have you discovered?" Morgana produced an ancient scroll, its parchment yellowed with age. This dates to the time of the first Wolf Kings. It speaks of signs that precede major upheavals, changes that transform kingdoms in ways that cannot be undone. She began reading. When silver hair catches winter moonlight, when violet depths reflect the wolf's soul, the north shall know its greatest trial. One who has known chains shall test one who wears crown. The words could have described almost anyone if interpreted loosely enough, classic prophetic vagueness. But Magnus could not deny the specific details about silver hair and violet eyes. These prophecies are often symbolic rather than literal, General Brennan observed. Silver hair might represent wisdom. Reading them as specific physical descriptions seems to impose meanings the original authors may not have intended. There is more, Morgana continued. The prophecy speaks of a birthmark that identifies the one who brings this transformation. A crescent moon upon the left shoulder. Magnus felt his blood chill because he had seen exactly such a mark 2 nights ago when Alara's borrowed cloak had slipped. A perfect silver crescent on her left shoulder blade. The birthmark could be coincidence, Magnus said, forcing his voice to remain steady. Alara spoke before Morgana could respond. I do bear such a mark. It has been with me since birth. My mother told me it meant I was watched by forces greater than human understanding. The admission created heavy silence. If the prophecy was accurate in its specific details, what did that suggest about the rest of its predictions? Morgana's expression held vindication. You see, Your Majesty, this is not ordinary refugee. This is fulfillment of prophecies that warn of changes that will test everything we have built. Magnus looked at Alara and saw not prophetic danger, but woman who had survived circumstances that should have broken her. The prophecy might suggest she brought change, but change itself was not automatically destructive. We will research these prophecies further, Magnus declared. Elder Tobias will examine the original texts and provide analysis that considers multiple interpretations. In the meantime, Alara remains under royal protection while we verify the intelligence she has provided. It was compromise that gave something to both sides while committing fully to neither. The council accepted it with varying degrees of satisfaction. As the council dispersed, Magnus found himself alone with Alara in the chamber that suddenly felt smaller. She studied him with those remarkable violet eyes. You believe the prophecy, she said quietly. Not because you accept supernatural explanations, but because the specific details are too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Magnus moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. I believe that ancient texts sometimes contain wisdom that transcends the specific circumstances in which they were written. What I know is that your arrival has created complications I must now navigate without clear guidance. Alara joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her despite his wolf's continued rejection. If the prophecy suggests I bring destruction, perhaps the wisest choice would be for me to leave before that destruction manifests. The suggestion should have been relief. Instead, Magnus felt something in his chest clench with refusal. No. Whatever the prophecy means, whatever changes your presence might trigger, I will not respond to uncertainty by choosing the cowardice of avoidance. You stay until we understand what is actually occurring. Alara's expression shifted to something that might be hope or fear. Why? Why risk whatever the prophecy warns about for someone you met yesterday? Magnus turned to face her directly, close enough that the mate bond flared with intensity that sent fresh waves of pain through his system, even as it generated warmth that made the suffering seem worthwhile. Because I am tired of making decisions based on fear of what might happen, rather than assessment of what should happen if I possessed courage to choose based on principles. Because you deserve opportunity to prove whether you represent threat or promise. The words hung between them, carrying weight of commitment Magnus had not intended to make, but could not retract once spoken. They stood in silence, broken only by wind against stone, two people caught in circumstances neither fully understood, but both recognized as carrying implications that would extend far beyond their individual fates. The following 2 days passed in tense waiting. Magnus threw himself into tactical planning with General Brennan, preparing contingencies for multiple scenarios depending on what the scouts reported. Alara remained in her quarters, recovering from her injuries, while under discreet but constant observation by guards who reported her activities directly to Theron. During this period, Magnus found himself drawn to her chambers each evening, ostensibly to discuss tactical matters, but increasingly to simply talk. Their conversations ranged across subjects he had never explored with anyone else, discussions that challenged his assumptions about governance and power in ways that were both uncomfortable and exhilarating. "She has a gift for seeing through official justifications to underlying motivations," Magnus confided to Theron on the second evening. "When I explain why certain policies exist, she asks questions that reveal how those policies serve those who make them while harming those who lack power to resist." Theron's expression was carefully neutral. "You are becoming attached, Your Majesty." Magnus could not deny it. The mate bond pulled at him constantly, while his wolf's rejection had shifted from sharp pain to dull ache that he had learned to function through. "I am becoming aware of perspectives I have ignored because my position made such ignorance comfortable." The scouts returned on schedule, their report confirming Alara's assessment with precision that erased any remaining doubt about her capabilities. Iron Peak forces were indeed moving through the mountain pass using advanced logistics techniques that would have achieved complete surprise if not for her warning. But her analysis of secondary threats proved even more valuable. Additional scouts Magnus had sent to Ironforge discovered enemy reconnaissance teams observing the supply depot from concealed positions, clearly preparing for assault that would have been catastrophic if executed while Magnus's forces were committed elsewhere. "She saved us from disaster," General Brennan said as they reviewed the intelligence in the war room. "Not just tactical defeat, but strategic catastrophe that would have crippled our ability to respond to threats for months." Magnus felt vindication mixed with concern about implications. If her intelligence is this accurate, it makes her even more valuable as asset and more dangerous as potential enemy. "She chose to share information that saved our kingdom," Brennan replied. "That suggests where her loyalties lie." "Or suggests sophisticated deception designed to build trust before exploitation," Valerius interjected from his position at the table. "We must not allow gratitude for useful intelligence to blind us to possibility that she serves interests we have not yet identified." Before Magnus could respond, Theron entered with expression suggesting new complications had emerged. "Your Majesty, Elder Tobias requests immediate private audience. He claims to have discovered information regarding the prophecies that changes everything." Magnus excused himself from the war room and made his way to Tobias's study, where the elderly scholar sat surrounded by ancient texts and scrolls that covered every available surface. The old man's face bore weight of someone who had discovered truth he wished he could unlearn. "Your Majesty," Tobias began without preamble, "I have completed research you requested regarding the prophecies. What I discovered requires immediate discussion before you proceed with any plans regarding Lady Alara's status." Magnus settled into chair opposite the scholar. "What have you found?" Tobias unrolled parchment that appeared even more ancient than the scroll Morgana had presented. The prophecy High Priestess Morgana presented was accurate in its details, but incomplete in its context. "I found the original scroll in restricted archives that required special permission to access." He gestured to the text before him. "The prophecy does predict upheaval associated with meeting between Northern King and one bearing silver hair and violet eyes marked with crescent moon. But the upheaval described is not destruction of kingdom, as Morgana suggested. Rather, it describes transformation from one form to another, ending of old patterns that have grown corrupt, birth of new arrangements that better serve populations." Magnus studied the text and recognized how selective quotation could transform prediction about necessary change into warning about destructive catastrophe. "So Morgana manipulated the interpretation?" "Not necessarily manipulated," Tobias replied carefully, "but certainly chose interpretation that served particular political interests. Those who benefit from current power structures naturally fear changes that might redistribute authority." Magnus absorbed this. "What else have you discovered?" Tobias pulled out another set of documents. "I researched the Silvermane exile that occurred 200 years ago, examining records that were sealed at the time. What I discovered suggests that exile was not response to betrayal, as official histories claim. Rather, Silvermane House advocated for social reforms that would have altered power arrangements. They proposed treating Omegas as citizens with legal rights rather than property. They suggested merit-based advancement. They argued for transparency and governance. The revelations painted picture of history deliberately distorted to serve interests of those who had won political conflicts. Magnus felt his understanding shifting with disorienting rapidity. If the prophecy is about necessary reform rather than destructive catastrophe, Magnus said slowly, then those who fear it most are those whose power depends on preventing exactly the changes it describes. Tobias nodded. Precisely. But there is something else you must know immediately. Lady Alara is not distant Silvermane relative as we assumed. He produced a genealogical chart marked with careful annotations. According to these records, she is direct descendant of the last Silvermane househead through his eldest daughter's line. Under Kingdom's ancient laws regarding dynastic succession, her claim to throne is actually stronger than your own if she chose to press such claim through legal channels that remain technically valid. The revelation transformed everything about Alara's presence in Frostholm. She was not merely refugee or tactical asset. She was legitimate heir whose existence threatened Magnus's authority if she chose to leverage her legal position. "Does she know?" Magnus asked. "I do not believe so. These records were sealed specifically to prevent any Silvermane descendants from discovering their legal standing." Magnus stood and moved to the window, processing implications. If this becomes known, every noble house that has grievances with my rule will rally behind her claim. It could tear the kingdom apart in civil war. Or it could provide foundation for exactly the reforms the prophecy suggests are necessary, Tobias said quietly. If you and Lady Alara were to govern together rather than compete for sole authority. The suggestion was revolutionary. Magnus felt his world shifting beneath foundations he had thought eternal. You propose shared rule? I propose that perhaps the prophecy's wisdom is precisely this, that kingdoms evolve beyond frameworks that concentrate absolute power in single individual. That accountability and distributed authority might serve populations better than traditions designed to consolidate control. Before Magnus could respond, urgent knocking interrupted them. Theron entered with face that communicated crisis. "Your Majesty, Lord Cassius Ravenwood has arrived at our gates requesting immediate audience. He came with minimal escort under flag of peace, but his presence creates complications." The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Magnus felt pieces falling into place. The military operations were never meant to succeed. They were diversion to create circumstances where Cassius could enter Frostholm with legitimate excuse while I was focused on external threats. Theron nodded grimly. His actual objective was likely retrieving Lady Alara before she could compromise more of his capabilities. Magnus made his decision. Cassius will be received with diplomatic courtesy, but Lady Alara remains under royal protection regardless of what claims he may make. And Theron, inform Lady Alara about what Tobias has discovered regarding her lineage. She deserves to know before facing her former master. As Theron departed, Magnus turned back to Tobias. "If she chooses to press her claim, what would you counsel?" The old scholar smiled sadly. "I would counsel that the hardest wisdom is learning when to share power rather than hoarding it. Your father understood that, though he died before he could act on such understanding. Perhaps you will have the courage he lacked the time to demonstrate." Magnus left the study with mind racing through implications and possibilities, knowing that the next hours would determine not just his own fate, but the shape of his kingdom for generations to come. The prophecy was unfolding exactly as foretold, but the destruction it brought was not of the kingdom itself, but of assumptions about how power had to function, and whether love could become foundation for governance rather than weakness that enemies exploited. The wolf inside him stirred for the first time in days, not with pain or rejection, but with something that felt almost like recognition. as though some part of him understood that the mate bond his consciousness had known from first scent might finally be approaching resolution that would either heal him or destroy everything he had tried to build through years of careful isolation from exactly this kind of vulnerability. The Great Hall had been prepared for formal diplomatic reception within the hour following Cassius's arrival, banners representing both kingdoms hanging from stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of negotiations ranging from trade agreements to declarations of war. Magnus took his position on the throne that symbolized authority he wielded while remaining aware that symbols held power only to the extent that those observing them chose to grant significance to representations that were ultimately just cloth and metal, arranged according to patterns that culture imbued with meaning. The evening light filtering through high windows cast long shadows across the polished stone floor, creating an atmosphere that felt both regal and ominous, as though the hall itself recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Magnus had spent the past 2 hours in tactical preparation with General Brennan and Captain Theron, wargaming possible scenarios and planning responses to every negotiating position Cassius might adopt. Yet beneath the strategic thinking, his wolf continued its strange evolution from painful rejection to something that felt increasingly like anticipation, as though his nature recognized that resolution approached, even if his conscious mind could not yet perceive its form. Elara entered through the side entrance reserved for royal advisors, and Magnus felt his breath catch despite having seen her only hours earlier. She had been informed of her lineage, of the legal claims she could press if she chose, yet she had requested only that she be allowed to face Cassius with Magnus, rather than hiding from confrontation that she insisted was necessary for her to move beyond the years she had spent as invisible property in service that had stolen her agency while simultaneously providing her with knowledge that had proven invaluable to Magnus's kingdom. She wore clothing borrowed from the castle's formal wardrobe, deep blue that complemented her silver hair and violet eyes in ways that made the prophetic description seem less like mystical coincidence and more like simple, accurate observation of remarkable beauty. But it was not her appearance that commanded attention as she moved to stand at Magnus's right hand in position, normally reserved for consorts or chief advisors. It was her bearing, the way she carried herself with dignity, that circumstances had tried to strip away, but had ultimately only refined through the same process that transformed raw ore into tempered steel through application of pressure and heat that would destroy weaker materials. "Your Majesty," Theron said quietly from his position near the main entrance, "Lord Cassius approaches." The doors swung open with ceremonial weight, and Cassius Ravenwood entered with confidence of man accustomed to deference, his bearing communicating power accumulated through decades of strategic alliance building and military success that had made his territory essential to stability of northern regions. He was perhaps 50 years old, his aristocratic features marked by lines that suggested both intelligence and calculation, a face that revealed nothing except what its owner chose to show. 3 attendants followed at respectful distance, enough to maintain dignity without creating impression of military escort that might suggest hostile rather than diplomatic intentions. His eyes swept the hall with assessment that catalogued everything from guard positions to architectural features before settling on Magnus with expression that conveyed respectful neutrality appropriate for discussions between territorial leaders of comparable power. But when his gaze shifted and found Elara standing in position of clear significance rather than cowering in fear or hiding from his presence, genuine surprise broke through his controlled expression with force that revealed this development had not been anticipated, despite whatever intelligence networks had informed him of her presence in Frostholm. The surprise lasted perhaps 3 seconds before his diplomatic mask reasserted itself. But those 3 seconds told Magnus everything he needed to know about Cassius's expectations and how thoroughly those expectations had just been disrupted by reality that refused to conform to assumptions about how Omegas who fled service should behave when confronted by masters who had owned them. "Lord Cassius," Magnus said, his voice carrying the formal authority appropriate for diplomatic reception while maintaining undertones that communicated he would not tolerate disrespect toward Elara, regardless of what history existed between her and the visiting lord. "Welcome to Frostholm. I understand you requested urgent audience to discuss matters that could not wait for standard diplomatic process. Please enlighten me regarding the nature of urgency that brings you to my gates during winter conditions that normally discourage travel, except under most pressing circumstances." Cassius's attention remained fixed on Alara for a moment longer before returning to Magnus with expression that suggested rapid recalculation of approach and objectives. "Your Majesty, I come bearing proposals regarding alliance between our territories, matters of mutual benefit that require discussion before circumstances evolve beyond point where cooperation remains a viable option for either of us. However, I confess surprise at finding property that disappeared from my household 3 weeks ago, now standing in position of apparent confidence within your court. This development creates complications that may affect the nature of discussions I had intended to pursue." The casual reference to Alara as property sent controlled fury through Magnus's system, his wolf stirring with protective instincts that had been dormant for 8 years, but now felt increasingly present, despite the mysterious rejection that had characterized their initial response to the mate bond. Magnus kept his voice carefully modulated, despite the anger that wanted to sharpen his words into weapons. Lady Alara sought shelter during storm that would have killed her if I had turned her away. She arrived with nothing except determination to survive circumstances she no longer felt safe enduring. Her status here is not subject to negotiation or reclamation based on contracts signed under circumstances where refusing meant death from exposure or starvation. The declaration was clear enough that Cassius could not misunderstand Magnus's position, yet diplomatic enough to avoid direct insult that would make continued negotiation impossible. Cassius studied Magnus with calculation that suggested he was reassessing initial assumptions about how this audience would unfold. "Your Majesty's hospitality toward those in desperate circumstances is admirable," Cassius replied, his tone suggesting he was choosing words with care appropriate for navigating difficult terrain. "However, I'm certain you understand that legal frameworks governing contracts and obligations cannot simply be set aside because circumstances that led to those agreements appear unjust in retrospect. Property cannot declare itself free and expect such declarations to be honored by those who understand the importance of maintaining legal structures that provide stability and predictability in relationships between those of different stations." Before Magnus could respond to the provocation disguised as reasonable legal argument, Alara stepped forward with movement that made her healing ankle protest but did not prevent her from claiming space in conversation that Cassius clearly believed should occur between the two men without her participation. "Lord Cassius," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall with none of the deference that 15 years of service might have conditioned into her responses. "I understand you believe you have claim on me based on contracts signed under circumstances where my choices were death from exposure or acceptance of terms that could not be negotiated as agreements between equals. I am not here to argue about legal technicalities that were designed by those with power to ensure their continued power over those who had no choice except acceptance of arrangements that served one party while exploiting the other." She paused, and Magnus saw steel in her expression that made clear she had not spent 2 days preparing for this confrontation without developing strategy of her own. "But I will make you an offer that provides resolution to this situation without requiring either kingdom to compromise principles that appear irreconcilable. I possess 15 years of intelligence about your military capabilities, your political networks, your strategic thinking about everything from supply chain logistics to the specific commanders you trust with sensitive operations. I could share all of that information with King Magnus, providing him advantages that would take you years to overcome through operational security changes required once you knew your capabilities had been fully compromised." Cassius's face had gone rigid with recognition of threat she represented, understanding crystallizing about exactly how much damage she could inflict if she chose to weaponize knowledge she had accumulated during years of observation that he had never imagined would be remembered with such precision or understood with such sophistication. Or, Alara continued with calm that made the ultimatum even more effective through contrast with the magnitude of what she was offering. I can agree to maintain silence about everything I learned in your service beyond the minimal intelligence already shared that relates specifically to current military operations. I will treat those years as closed chapter, refusing to discuss or disclose anything about your methods, contacts, or strategic frameworks that do not directly threaten lives that can be saved through timely warning. In exchange, you will acknowledge that any contracts binding me to your household are terminated, that I am free to make my own choices about where I live and whom I serve. You lose potential advantage of having me return, but you prevent certain intelligence catastrophe that would follow if I chose to share everything I know with those who would use such information to dismantle power you have spent decades accumulating. The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity, offering Cassius clear choice between certain loss if he continued pressing claims and manageable loss if he accepted terms that prevented worse outcome. It also demonstrated strategic thinking that went beyond simple tactical awareness to encompass sophisticated understanding of negotiation dynamics and how to create situations where opposition chose acceptable paths because alternatives appeared catastrophically worse. Magnus felt admiration surge through his chest alongside the mate bond that flared with warmth rather than pain for the first time since Alara's arrival. She had not waited to be rescued or protected. She had armed herself with the very knowledge her enslavement had provided and transformed years of powerlessness into weapon that gave her agency to negotiate from position of strength rather than begging for mercy that would never come from those who saw her only as property to be reclaimed or destroyed if reclamation proved impossible. Cassius studied Alara with expression that cycled through anger, calculation, and finally something that might be grudging respect that acknowledged she had outmaneuvered him using knowledge she had gained while he dismissed her as incapable of the very strategic thinking she had just demonstrated. "You have learned well during your time observing those you served," he said finally, his words acknowledging defeat while attempting to maintain dignity through implication that she had been student rather than victim. "Perhaps too well for your own safety. There are those who would find your continued existence threatening regardless of what agreements we reach here today. The threat beneath surface civility was clear enough. Even if Cassius accepted her terms, she would remain target for those who feared what intelligence she possessed and might someday choose to reveal despite current agreements establishing boundaries around what she would share. The reality was that knowledge of the type she had accumulated could never be truly contained once the person possessing it demonstrated willingness to use it strategically. Any threats to Lady Alara will be treated as threats to my kingdom," Magnus said with quiet intensity that made his meaning unmistakable. "She is under royal protection, which means that anyone who harms her will face consequences that extend beyond individual retaliation to diplomatic and military responses that recognize assault on someone within my protection as assault on the authority and honor of Frostholm itself. And Lord Cassius, you should understand that Lady Alara's value to my kingdom extends far beyond the tactical intelligence she has already provided. She possesses perspectives and capabilities that make her essential to plans I'm developing for Frostholm's future." The declaration went beyond simple protection to establish Alara as person of significance whose loss would trigger responses that would make such loss catastrophically expensive for any party responsible. It was calculated to make the cost-benefit analysis of future assassination attempts clearly unfavorable, while also communicating to Alara that her safety mattered not just as moral obligation, but as strategic priority for his kingdom. Cassius held Magnus's gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly with recognition that circumstances had shifted beyond his initial expectations or planning. "Very well," he said, his tone suggesting acceptance that came from practical calculation rather than moral conviction. "I accept Lady Alara's proposal. Contracts binding her to my household are terminated effective immediately. In exchange, she will maintain silence about intelligence not directly relevant to immediate threats to life, as she has defined the boundaries. And Your Majesty, I trust you understand that this agreement represents significant concession on my part, one that I expect will be remembered when future circumstances require cooperation between our territories on matters of mutual interest." The words acknowledged defeat while positioning for future leverage, diplomatic recovery that salvaged what could be preserved from negotiation that had not unfolded according to his plans. Magnus recognized the maneuver and chose not to challenge it directly, understanding that allowing Cassius to maintain dignity in retreat served long-term interests better than forcing complete humiliation that would transform temporary setback into permanent enmity, requiring future resolution through violence rather than negotiation. "Your concession is noted and will be remembered appropriately," Magnus replied, his words carefully neutral regarding whether that memory would lead to reciprocation or simply awareness that Cassius had been forced to concede under circumstances he had not controlled. "Now, you mentioned proposals regarding alliance beyond the matter of Lady Alara's status. Perhaps we should discuss those matters in setting more conducive to detailed strategic conversation than formal reception allows." Cassius inclined his head in acceptance, but before formal negotiations could begin, Elder Tobias entered the Great Hall with unusual urgency that suggested developments that could not wait for diplomatic pleasantries to conclude. The elderly scholar approached Magnus's throne with scroll clutched in his weathered hands, an expression that communicated he had discovered something that required immediate attention, regardless of protocol that normally prevented interruptions during formal diplomatic receptions. "Your Majesty," Tobias said quietly, pitching his voice to be heard by Magnus while not broadcasting to entire hall. "I apologize for the interruption, but in researching the matters you requested, I have discovered one additional piece of information that directly affects the discussions currently underway. It concerns the legal frameworks governing dynastic succession and territorial authority." Magnus felt his pulse quicken with recognition that Tobias was about to reveal Alara's lineage in circumstances where such revelation could not be contained or managed through private discussion. The timing was either catastrophically poor or perfectly calculated, depending on whether one believed that truth revealed in presence of witnesses served better than truth shared in private, where its implications could be negotiated before becoming public knowledge that constrained available responses. "What have you discovered, Elder Tobias?" Magnus asked, committing to allowing the revelation to proceed in this public forum because attempting to delay it would only create suspicion about what he was trying to hide. Tobias unrolled the ancient scroll with visible reluctance, as though he wished he could retract the knowledge it contained, but recognized that ignorance once dispelled could not be restored through wishful thinking. "I have been researching historical records regarding the Silvermane exile that occurred 2 centuries ago. As your Majesty knows, Lady Alara bears the Silvermane name, but what we did not previously understand was the specific nature of her lineage within that house." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "According to genealogical records sealed at the time of the exile, Lady Alara is direct descendant of the last Silvermane househead through his eldest daughter's line. Under the kingdom's ancient laws regarding dynastic succession, which have never been formally repealed despite 2 centuries of neglect, her claim to throne is actually stronger than your own, Your Majesty. The Silvermane line predates the Blackthorn ascension by 3 generations, and the exile was political rather than legal dissolution of dynastic rights. The revelation sent shock through the assembled witnesses, servants and guards, whose presence had seemed merely functional now, became audience to disclosure that transformed understanding of power relationships and legal frameworks governing who possessed legitimate authority to rule. Magnus felt the mate bond surge with intensity that sent warmth rather than pain through his entire system, his wolf finally responding not with rejection, but with something that felt like recognition and acceptance, as though his nature understood what his conscious mind was still processing. Cassius's expression had shifted from diplomatic neutrality to active calculation as he processed implications of Tobias's revelation. "This changes circumstances considerably," he observed with careful attention to every word. "If Lady Alara possesses legitimate dynastic claims superior to the current ruling house, then questions of allegiance and alliance take on new dimensions that require reconsideration of assumptions about power distribution in the Northern Territories." Magnus recognized immediately that Cassius was positioning to exploit the revelation, to use newly disclosed information to destabilize Magnus's authority by suggesting that nobles who had grievances with Blackthorn rule now had legitimate alternative they could support without appearing to engage in simple rebellion against established order. The threat was real and immediate, potential for civil war that would tear the kingdom apart in conflict between competing claimants that would be decided through violence rather than negotiation or legal process that no longer functioned after 2 centuries of dynastic frameworks being ignored as irrelevant historical curiosities rather than binding legal structures. Before panic could spread or Cassius could further exploit the disclosure, Ilara stepped forward again with movement that commanded attention through sheer audacity of claiming space in conversation that tradition insisted belonged to those with established power, rather than those whose power remained theoretical, pending decisions about whether to press claims that legal frameworks technically supported. "Elder Tobias speaks truth," she said clearly. "I have learned of my lineage only today, but I understand the implications of what these genealogical records reveal. I possess legal claim to authority that 2 centuries of history have treated as extinct, but which technically remains valid under laws that have never been formally repealed despite long neglect." She turned to face Magnus directly, and he saw in her remarkable violet eyes something that took his breath away with its courage and clarity. "I could press this claim. I could gather support from those who have grievances with current rule, who see in ancient legal frameworks opportunity to pursue their own interests through supporting alternative that appears legitimate rather than rebellious. I could tear this kingdom apart in civil war that would be framed as restoration of proper dynastic succession rather than simple grab for power." The brutal honesty of her assessment silenced any who might have interrupted. Acknowledgement that she understood exactly what power she held and what damage she could inflict if she chose to weaponize her lineage the same way she had weaponized her intelligence about Cassius's military capabilities. "But I will not do this," Ilara continued, her words carrying weight that came from conviction rather than calculation. "I spent 15 years as property watching those with power make decisions that served their interests while justifying such decisions through elaborate frameworks that made self-serving choices appear as necessary responses to constraints that somehow always required maintaining arrangements that benefited those making decisions at expense of those lacking power to choose differently. I will not become what I survived by reproducing patterns that treated me as expendable resource rather than person whose dignity and agency mattered, regardless of station or circumstances." She paused, and Magnus saw her gathering herself for what came next. Proposal that would either resolve the crisis Tobias's revelation had created or make it catastrophically worse, depending on how it was received by those whose cooperation would be required for implementation. "I propose that King Magnus and I govern together as co-rulers with equal authority, neither subordinate to the other, both required to reach consensus on decisions affecting the kingdom, rather than one person wielding absolute power that history suggests corrupts, regardless of good intentions, that initially motivate those who gain such authority. This is not merger of dynasties through traditional marriage alliance where one house absorbs another. This is creation of new framework where power is shared and accountability is built into structure of governance itself, rather than depending on personal virtue of whoever happens to hold throne." The revolutionary nature of the proposal struck the assembled witnesses with force that created a moment of stunned silence before reactions began cascading through the hall. Servants whispered among themselves with excitement that suggested common people saw possibilities in shared rule that nobles might resist. Guards exchanged glances that communicated uncertainty about whether such arrangement could function or would simply create paralysis when decisive action required unified command. Cassius's expression revealed calculation about whether this development served his interests or threatened them in ways that required opposition. Magnus felt his world shifting beneath foundations he had thought eternal, recognition crystallizing that Ilara was proposing something that had never been successfully implemented in 3 centuries of Northern Territory's history, but which addressed fundamental problems with concentrated power that he had been forced to confront through their conversations over the past days. The mate bond surged with intensity that made his wolf finally break through years of dormancy, shift happening without conscious decision, as though his nature recognized that this moment required claiming his mate not through dominance but through partnership that honored both their strengths. The transformation rippled through his body with sensation that was simultaneously agony and ecstasy. 8 years of suppressed nature finally released through acceptance rather than control. His massive black wolf form emerged in the great hall, larger than any normal wolf, because alpha nature magnified physical presence to match authority of position. But instead of the violence that often accompanied shifts after prolonged suppression, Magnus's wolf moved with deliberate grace toward Alara, circling her once before settling at her side with posture that communicated protection and claim simultaneously. The mate bond completed with visible manifestation of golden light that illuminated the hall with warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature, connection that felt like truth written into fabric of reality rather than choice or chance. When Magnus shifted back to human form moments later, he found himself kneeling before Alara, not in submission, but in acknowledgement that partnership required vulnerability from both parties, willingness to share power rather than hoarding it, as though authority diminished when distributed rather than strengthened through collaborative exercise. "I accept your proposal," Magnus said, his voice carrying clearly through hall that had fallen completely silent. "We will govern as equals, neither subordinate to the other, both required to reach consensus on matters affecting our people. This is new territory without precedent to guide us, but perhaps that is exactly why it represents wisdom rather than foolishness. The old ways have led us to circumstances where power serves those who hold it rather than those who live under its exercise. Let us see whether new frameworks can do better." He rose and took her hand, gesture that communicated commitment more clearly than any verbal declaration could express. The assembly erupted in response that ranged from enthusiastic support among common people who saw in shared rule possibility for voices that had been excluded to find representation, to concerned murmuring among nobles who recognized that distributed authority might limit their ability to influence policy through cultivation of relationship with single ruler who could grant favors without requiring consensus. Cassius watched the developments with expression that suggested he was reassessing every assumption he had held about northern politics and power distribution. "This is unprecedented," he observed, though his tone suggested recognition rather than objection. "You understand that other kingdoms will resist such changes, that traditions exist not merely because of inertia, but because they serve interests of those with power to prevent alterations that might diminish advantages their position provides." Magnus met Cassius's gaze directly. "I understand that choosing to do what is right often means choosing to do what is hard, that principles matter most when upholding them requires sacrifice, rather than when supporting them costs nothing of substance. We will face opposition, but we will face it together with framework that prevents either of us from becoming the very thing we seek to reform." The words were commitment to vision that would test everything they believed about themselves and what they were willing to endure for possibilities that tradition insisted were impossible, but conscience suggested might be necessary if kingdoms were to evolve beyond frameworks that increasingly served power rather than people supposedly being served through exercise of authority. General Brennan approached the throne with expression that mixed concern with something that might be hope. "Your Majesty, your Majesties," he corrected himself with slight smile. "This new arrangement will require practical implementation that addresses questions of military command, legal authority, and diplomatic representation. We will need to establish protocols that allow for shared rule without creating paralysis when rapid decisions are required." "You are correct," Magnus acknowledged, "and you will be essential to developing those protocols. But for tonight, let it be enough that we have established new direction, even if the path remains unclear. Tomorrow we begin the hard work of transforming vision into functional reality." As the formal reception dissolved into discussions about implementation and implications, Magnus found himself alone with Alara in alcove near the great hall's eastern windows, where moonlight turned snow-covered courtyard into landscape of silver and shadow. She studied him with eyes that held questions about whether he truly understood what they had committed to attempting. "You could have claimed sole authority," she said quietly. "Tobias's revelation about my lineage gave you reason to eliminate rival claim through methods that would have been politically defensible, even if morally questionable. Instead, you chose to share power with someone you met only days ago. Why? Magnus considered the question that touched on motivations he was still processing himself. Because I spent 12 years believing that strength meant isolation, that love made kings vulnerable in ways that enemies would exploit. But watching you face Cassius with nothing except intelligence and courage you developed while enslaved taught me that real strength comes from connection rather than separation. You made yourself strong through years of careful observation, while others who owned you believed you incapable of the very strategic thinking you demonstrated tonight. If you could transform powerlessness into power through wisdom and patience, perhaps we can transform kingdoms through similar commitment to seeing clearly and choosing wisely, even when wisdom requires abandoning comfortable assumptions about how authority must function. Alara's hand found his in darkness between them, touch that communicated acceptance and commitment and recognition that they were beginning journey whose destination remained unknown, but whose direction felt true in ways that bypassed rational analysis to touch deeper certainty about right action, regardless of outcome uncertainty. The wolf inside Magnus settled into contentment he had not felt in 8 years, mate bond no longer source of pain, but foundation for partnership that would either change everything or destroy them both depending on whether vision could survive, contact with reality that would test every assumption about possibility and limitation. Outside the windows, snow continued falling with quiet persistence, covering old tracks while creating fresh canvas upon which new patterns could be written by those willing to risk everything, on belief that kingdoms could evolve and that love was not weakness, but the courage to build together what neither could create alone when surrounded by those who insisted that power hoarded was power preserved and that sharing authority meant losing it rather than multiplying its effectiveness through collaborative exercise that served populations rather than merely maintaining control. The prophecy had fulfilled itself exactly as foretold, not through destruction of kingdom, but through transformation of frameworks governing how power functioned and who possessed voice in decisions that shaped countless lives. The North had known its greatest trial, and through that trial had begun journey toward becoming something that ancient texts had predicted, but contemporary wisdom had insisted was impossible to achieve. Tomorrow would bring challenges that neither Magnus nor Alara could fully anticipate, resistance from those whose interests depended on maintaining traditional arrangements, practical problems of implementation that vision alone could not solve, tests of whether partnership could survive disagreements that consensus governance would inevitably create. But tonight, it was enough to stand together in moonlight and know that they had chosen courage over fear, that they had seen possibility where tradition insisted only impossibility existed, that they had claimed each other not through dominance, but through mutual recognition that some bonds transcended power and politics, to touch truths that made everything else seem provisional by comparison. The kingdom that emerged from this night would be different from one that had existed before, shaped by choices made in Great Hall, where prophecy and politics had collided to create space for innovations that would be judged by future generations as either wisdom or catastrophe, depending on whether implementation matched vision and whether courage proved sufficient to sustain transformation through inevitable difficulties ahead. But in this moment, in alcove where moonlight illuminated two people who had found each other through storm and circumstance and choice, it felt like beginning of something that mattered more than crowns or kingdoms or any authority that could be claimed through force rather than earned through demonstrated commitment to serving those whose lives depended on wisdom of those making decisions that power made possible but character determined. The little Omega who had asked to sleep by a king's gate had indeed found her place beside him, not through rescue or charity, but through proving herself worthy of partnership that honored both their strengths, while acknowledging that together they might build something neither could achieve alone when surrounded by traditions insisting that power shared was power lost, rather than power multiplied through collaborative exercise that created accountability currently absent from structures designed to concentrate rather than distribute authority. And the king who had believed isolation was strength had learned that real courage meant opening heart that had been frozen for 12 years, accepting vulnerability that partnership required, while trusting that mate bond recognized through pain and pleasure would provide foundation for governance that served rather than merely ruled, that listened rather than merely commanded, that evolved rather than merely preserved arrangements designed for circumstances that no longer existed if they ever truly had. The Wolf King had found his salvation, and in saving himself, had opened door to possibilities that might save them all if vision could survive journey from inspiration to implementation, if courage proved renewable rather than resource that depleted through use, if love remained foundation when challenged by realities that romance never anticipated, but partnership would need to navigate together or fail separately when tested by forces that resisted change, with determination equal to their commitment to pursuing it. The story that began with whispered request at Frozen Gate had transformed into something larger than either protagonist, narrative about how kingdoms evolved and whether power could serve rather than merely perpetuate itself. When those wielding it possessed wisdom, to recognize that authority unshared was authority corrupted through isolation from perspectives and voices it needed to hear if governance was to serve populations, rather than merely maintaining control over them through mechanisms designed for consolidation, rather than distribution of both power and accountability that power required if it was to remain legitimate rather than simply forceful. History would judge whether they succeeded or failed in unprecedented experiment in shared rule. But tonight, in moonlight that illuminated faces marked by experiences that should have broken them, but had instead forged strength through suffering, success seemed possible in ways that made tomorrow worth facing, despite uncertainty about obstacles that would inevitably emerge when vision collided with reality, resistant to change. They stood together as equals who had chosen each other freely, as partners who would govern collaboratively, as mates whose bond had been tested through rejection and pain before flowering into recognition that felt like coming home after lifelong exile from possibility, that tradition had insisted could not exist. But experience proved otherwise when courage exceeded caution, and when love became reason rather than excuse for choices that transformed everything that came before into preparation for everything that would follow. The Northern Kingdom had entered new era, not through conquest or revolution, but through decision made by two people who saw possibility where others saw only impossibility, who chose partnership over domination, who believed that prophecies spoke truth about necessary change rather than warnings about destruction to be prevented through maintaining arrangements that served some while oppressing many. And somewhere in depths of castle archives, ancient scrolls recorded predictions that had taken 2 centuries to fulfill. Words written by those who understood that kingdoms evolved through individuals willing to see beyond limitations that present circumstances appeared to impose, willing to risk everything on vision that contemporaries dismissed as fantasy, but which became reality when courage proved sufficient to transform inspiration into implementation, despite opposition from those whose power depended on preventing exactly the changes that prophecy had foretold and that present moment had finally brought into being through choices made by Wolf King and Silver Omega, who had found each other through storm and circumstance and mutual recognition that some connections transcended everything that should have kept them apart. The story was far from over, but this chapter had reached conclusion that felt like beginning rather than ending, opening rather than closing, invitation rather than resolution. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight belonged to possibility, to choice, to courage that made impossible seem merely difficult, and difficult seem worth attempting when surrounded by those willing to try together what tradition insisted could never succeed when attempted separately. The kingdom had been transformed not through destruction but through willingness to evolve, and in that transformation lay hope that power could serve rather than merely perpetuate itself when those wielding it possessed wisdom to recognize that authority shared became authority, strengthened through perspectives and voices, that concentration of power systematically excluded from decisions affecting lives, that exclusion could not silence except through mechanisms that governance claiming legitimacy could not employ without revealing itself as force rather than authority, control rather than leadership, domination rather than service. They had chosen service, chosen partnership, chosen each other freely. Everything that followed would build on that foundation or fail for lack of any better alternative in a world where isolation masquerading as strength had proven insufficient for challenges requiring collaboration that honored contributions from all, rather than concentrating decision-making in structures designed to prevent exactly the kind of distributed authority that implementation of shared rule would require if vision was to become functional reality rather than remaining merely aspirational ideal that inspired without transforming. The transformation had begun. The rest would be determined by whether courage proved renewable, whether partnership survived disagreements, whether vision could be sustained through challenges that no amount of planning could fully anticipate, but which committed partnership might navigate successfully if mutual respect remained stronger than inevitable frustrations that collaboration created when consensus required compromise that neither party would choose if acting alone, but both could accept when acting together toward goals that mattered more than individual preferences about methods employed to pursue them. The prophecy was fulfilled. The story continued. And in moonlight streaming through ancient windows, two people stood together facing future they had chosen to create rather than accepting past they had inherited, ready to build kingdom that served all its people, or fail gloriously in attempt that mattered more than safe preservation of arrangements designed for circumstances that no longer existed if they ever truly had.